Today. And joining me in the studio is Annabel Crabb. She's been sitting here very patiently for the past few hours. Annabel, a few hours ago, the last time we chatted, I asked you about how much is all of this, to your eyes, a political statement, how much is it an environmental initiative? Now, in light of all that we've heard over the past few hours since I last posed that question, let me put it to you again.
Yeah, I'd like to slightly amend my answer. I think we can learn about what's going on today, one, by reading what the government has actually announced, and then by listening to how Julia Gillard has talked about it. And I think that tells you just how much of a political exercise this is at this stage. The spread and extent of the household compensation and the amount of work that's gone into ensuring that you absolutely minimise the number of people who can stand up and say, well, look, I feel hard done by on this account is quite instructive. They've rolled in tax reform as well to try and assuage some of the concerns of people in middle and lower income Australia who feel already very, very pinched by the onset of higher electricity prices and cost of living increases and so on. So then if we have a look at the way the Prime Minister actually announced this whole, started her campaign, I suppose, in the press conference that she did just afternoon today. She started off by dealing with the science and the environmental issue very quickly off the top. She just said, look, she talked about the avalanche of science, the avalanche of proof that global warming is an issue and is an issue for Australia. Then she went straight from there into a very direct appeal, I think, to Australian households and householders. She reminded us about 10 times that this is a tax that is paid by big polluters, not by households. She reminded everybody again and again that the price increases and costs of living would be heavily compensated for, and in the vast majority of households would not constitute a significant extra impost. And then she also, I think, implicitly apologised along the way for how confusing this debate's been up until now. Do you remember she said quite a few times there's been some false starts? There's been some. We've been talking about this for a long time, and I think most viewers would probably, defeatedly, assent to that proposition. And she said the time for talk is over, and it's now time to act. So that's the way she's trying to make a break, I think, with the terrible difficulties that this particular policy area has fallen into in the past few years.
And she made the point from the outset as well, saying, in essence, this is incredibly simple. But for folks sitting at home who have been watching this for the last couple of hours, and they heard those figures for households, put up what it means for households, and then they heard the government's reading of it. They've just heard Tony Abbott's reading of those same figures, what it means for households. Vastly different stories that we've just heard.
Well, that's right. And Tony Abbott's catch-all, I think, exit for any discussion about the figures that the government's put up today is, he says, well, you can't trust anything this government says anyway. And when I say this has become a political dispute, I think that's a pretty good demonstration of it. Tony Abbott, I think, has taken the sort of anti-expert view on all of this. He says he doesn't necessarily agree with the majority of economists. He's on record in the past as not agreeing with the majority of scientists. And here he says, I've seen the government's figures. And he says that there's a disparity, for instance, between the government's estimate that the standard household will be, on average, $9.90 a week in the red from this scheme and will be compensated on average $10.10. Tony Abbott just says, well, look, that's 20 cents of wiggle room, and with this government's history of incompetence, do you think that makes you feel any safer? So we sort of, I think in that sense, we've kind of left the realm of figures and we've got into the politics of to what extent do you trust this government to do what it says it's going to do. And that brings us back to that intensely central political discussion about the undertaking on the carbon tax and so on, which is something that Tony Abbott will be relying on very heavily.
The question that the PM posed in her opening remarks, where she said what most Australians will be asking is, what does this mean for me?
That's right. And
in light of all what we've listened to, is that any clearer? Are we any closer to an answer that most Australians will go, well, that's what this means for me?
In the sense that all of the questions that have been thrown up in recent months about what could be in this package, and keep in mind, mind when you've got a government that's sitting in a room with the Australian Greens, a party that's had some very, very different views in the past from the Labor government, even on exactly who should be paying a carbon tax or a carbon price and who should be compensated and who shouldn't be. I think it has been legitimate to ask those questions. The package that we seem to see today, look, I may be pelted by projectiles from Greens viewers, but it's not hugely different from the carbon pollution reduction scheme that we had under Kevin Rudd. I mean, that question was put to Bob Brown during his press conference in the sense, how come you've hung around for this package when you could have signed up to the last one? He said, well, look, no, it's very different. For instance, one of the things that they disliked about the Rudd government's carbon pollution reduction scheme was that it involved $20 billion of payments to polluters over 10 years. Well, this one involves $10 billion over 5 years, but then the Productivity Commission will be jumping in to offer some advice, So, the Greens have given away a lot over the course of this negotiation. And I think it was Tony Windsor who said, or maybe Rob Oakeshott, they tend to blend into one sometimes, in their subsequent press conference said, well, look, it was a good thing that the Greens came to the table and negotiated. Now, there's some areas where the government and the Greens haven't been able to get agreement. And I think that's one of the really interesting things we've learnt today, is that they're going to put a bit of stuff in the too hard basket, stuff that the Greens couldn't agree to, like increased assistance to the coal and steel sectors, is going to be put through Parliament, as far as I can tell from what the Prime Minister and the Greens have just said in their press conferences. They're going to go through Parliament sort of separately. Presumably the government is hoping to get support from the coalition for increased assistance to those sectors. The other thing that the Greens and the government weren't able to agree upon in the course of their months of negotiations behind those closed doors was the question of interim targets that Australia would commit to. Now, one of the big surprises in the package was that the government has agreed to sign up to an 80% cut by 2050. But it's kind of getting there that's the difficult bit. And what the government and the Greens have done is effectively hand it all over to Bernie Fraser, who's going to be part of this Climate Authority. What's the name of the organisation? I think it's the Climate Authority, which is going to have an inquiry, look into this at about 2014 and come up with some interim caps and targets for this scheme.
In the short term, and I know you touched on this in your drum piece that you wrote, do you see any grounds for recalling of Parliament now the details are out there, that to recall the Parliament and discuss this now?
Well, I think there'll be plenty of opportunities to discuss it when Parliament does return. Tony Abbott last week was very keen to bring Parliament back this week to have a bit of a poke and prod at this package. I think there'll be plenty of opportunities for that, and certainly the Greens have signed up to some sort of Senate inquiry as well before this actually goes through the Parliament. But, one of the interesting elements of this equation that we now have is that we have a very unusual piece of government policy in the sense that it's been designed by the government in collusion with the people who might otherwise have voted against it. The Greens are kind of in the tent now in the same way that Meg Lees and the Democrats were in on the last bit of the design of the goods and services tax under John Howard. And in that sense, it's kind of it's about as close to a certainty as you get in this wildly uncertain political world in which we now live, that it will go through Parliament. The big task is for the government to actually convince people to, A, wake up, the Australian voters, to wake up and submit themselves to more talk about this carbon policy, which has had a few false starts, as the Prime Minister reminded us, over the last few years, and to come on board, to register, have a look at the scheme, work out how it affects them, and to be convinced by it. And that's the Prime Minister's big task.
Annabel Crabb, thanks so much for your insights there.